Is Zionism evil, unjust, and undemocratic? In this episode of Uncensored, we explore these questions from an academic perspective. The following documentary is based on a research project conducted in 2012, which described the State of Israel as a refuge from ethnic, religious, and political persecution. We will not discuss the impact of the latest wars in the last 11 years, but the original establishment of a Jewish state, ethno-religious homeland, and safe environment for Jewish life. Welcome to this special report from David Daniel Gonzalez, host and producer of Mystic Skeptic Radio. Introduction. In December 2016, around the time of the election of Donald Trump, anti-Semite neo-Nazi Richard Spencer visited Texas A&M University and held a talk spouting his vitriol and hatred. Jewish student organization's Rabbi Matt Rosenberg attended this event. During the Q&A, he invited Spencer to join him in Torah study. Spencer, as a master manipulator, decided to not take him up on the invitation, but rather made a speech about how white supremacists want the same things as Jews: a distinct culture, no contamination from foreigners, and a homeland. He went further, saying that Jews would not exist if they had assimilated years back. He feels that whites should look up to the State of Israel for their desire to survive just like them. Rabbi Rosenberg was taken aback by this inversion of Nazi rhetoric now being pointed back to the Zionist state. It is surprising that Jews are not able to respond, as the it clear and apparent that this repugnant leader of the modern racist movement is ignorant of Judaism, Zionism, and Jewish claims for a homeland. I would ask him the following questions. How can a Nazi talk about the US being their homeland when they have several countries in Europe where they can be embraced as brothers? Professor and expert on Nazi Germany. Eric Kurlander, help me make sense of this situation. In one of our conversations online, he stated the following: Spencer is an outstanding debater. His counterpart obviously wasn't. Zionism emerged in the late 19th context of rampant ethnic nationalism, which was endemic across Europe and contributed to nationalist fascist movements in dozens of countries. That relatively few Jews embraced it before the Holocaust is a testament to Jewish liberalism, cosmopolitanism, and secularism. That many have at least grudgingly accepted Zionism, of the more moderate variety, post-1945, is more a product of perceived necessity, having a Jewish state in case of catastrophe, than an ethno-nationalist conviction. My response to Spencer, as your question seems to suggest, would be that Jews, even most Israeli Zionist Jews, would prefer to live in a liberal, pluralist, cosmopolitan world and still represent that approach disproportionately to most other ethno-religious groups. But many Jews and liberal non-Jews recognize that the world is more complicated than that and therefore support Israel, with some caveats. It would be historically absurd, however, to conflate Zionism of a very small ethno-religious minority whose population was decimated by white nationalists, Nazis, and could be again by Arab nationalists, and that has therefore, wrongly, produced some restrictive, oppressive policies toward Arab Palestinians, with the white nationalism of a dominant ethnic group numbering in the hundreds of millions that still controls the governments and economies of many major global powers and has murdered tens of millions of Jews, Slavs, Africans, Native Americans, etc. in its name. Zionism definition according to Britannica. Zionism, Jewish nationalist movement that has had as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews, known in Hebrew as Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Though Zionism originated in Eastern and Central Europe in the latter part of the 19th century, It is in many ways a continuation of the ancient attachment of the Jews and of the Jewish religion to the historical region of Palestine, where one of the hills of ancient Jerusalem was called Zion. The State of Israel was established by the Jewish people as a beacon of hope for their survival. Currently, the international community seems to have conveniently forgotten the history of persecution Jews faced in Europe and the Middle East. I hope to not only address these objections, which are at times ignorant of world history or outright anti-Semitic in their conclusions, but to explore the following question: how is the State of Israel the only possible safe haven for Jews facing global anti-Semitism? Historical context. The State of Israel has an unprecedented history and is currently facing a very challenging situation. The State of Israel not only came about because of global anti-Semitism, but is also a testament to the bitter history of Jewish persecution and longing for messianic redemption in the Holy Land. The State of Israel attests to the connection Jews feel towards Zion, as it has been the focal point of many Jewish sages, poets, and intellectuals throughout history. It is also significant that throughout the many revolts against occupying powers in the ancient world, Jewish independence was always the aim. The existence of the State of Israel is often considered questionable, since it is perceived to have been created at the expense of its indigenous Arab population. The international debate over who has the right to this land does not consider the historical injustices that the Jewish people have suffered. This includes how Jewish identity and national aspirations survived in exile after the conquest of Israel and Judea by the Romans. We will start our discussion with the historical precedent for the Israeli claim to the Holy Land. When the State of Israel was formed, there was some opposition from certain countries, mostly in the Arab world. The book Israel Among the Family of Nations discusses some of their contentions. The main argument was that the Palestinian Arabs represented indigenous majority of the population in Palestine and had a natural right to independence. Hence, independence should be granted to Palestine as an Arab state. The Arab side, too, was thus invoking the right to national self-determination. The League of Nations, in their support for a plan to partition the country, contrary to the wishes of the majority, its inhabitants, favored Jews over Arabs instead of supporting an independent state under the rule of the Arab majority. The reality was that Arab nations were not even willing to consider the Jewish claim for independence due to their dismissal of Jewish peoplehood. That form of discrimination brought about a bitter battle for the Holy Land, which was fought passionately by both groups. However, the proposed solution to the Jewish refugee problem after World War II was to provide an opportunity for two independent states to live side by side. The UNSCOP Majority Report recognized the legitimacy of the Palestinian Arabs' aspirations to independence, but sought to also take into account the Jewish national aspirations and consequently proposed partition. At that time, the Jewish population living in Palestine had the right to secede and was supported by the international community, represented by the League of Nations. A similar situation took place in India and Pakistan. Those countries are an example of an international precedent for this type of partition. The League of Nations has been accused of acting in favoritism. However, their solution brought an opportunity for Jewish independence, not conquest. In both cases, India, Pakistan, and the State of Israel, Palestinian territories, the world faced two religious ethnic communities who were at odds for the same piece of land. The partition created a feasible alternative, although it cost many lives as it was implemented. It is important to note that the Palestinian quarrel with the West did not start with the League of Nations policy after World War II, but began with the 1936-1939 Arab Revolt that was in large part aimed at expelling the Jewish population of the Holy Land and succeeded in blocking legal immigration. This is documented in the book Anti-Semitism, A History Portrayed. Opposition to the Jewish state originated partially in Islamic anti-Semitism and pan-Arab nationalism and was displayed by the positive attitude of Arab leaders toward the Nazis from the 30s. At that time, Palestine was under dispute both as part of Greater Syria or as a Turkish territory. According to a Syrian delegate in the League of Nations General Assembly on May 14, 1948, there is no distinction whatever between the Palestinians and Syrians, and, had it not been for the Balfour Declaration and the terms of the Mandate, Palestine would now be a Syrian province, as it used to be. While there is a long history of Jewish migration to Palestine, the Shoah created a Jewish refugee crisis which awakened Arab xenophobia. The local population overreacted to the vigorous policy of immigration pursued by the Jewish leadership, which sharpened the Arab fear of danger from the intruding Jewish population. It is interesting to note that nowadays the Arab nations and their supporters use the plight of Palestinian refugees for political purposes. These same individuals blame Zionism for the current Palestinian extremism. The book Israel and the Family of Nations states the following: the Palestinian national identity developed during and under the influence of the Palestinian Arabs' confrontation with Zionism as a reaction to the Zionist enterprise under the auspices of the British Mandate. Palestinians claim that the Arab right to independence was crushed by the West, and they have the same rights to an Arab nation or Arab homeland as the Jews. Palestine, under their leadership, would not become a multi-ethnic utopia, but an Arab Muslim nation holding minorities under their control. Jews under Muslim Arab rule. There are many historical examples of Jews living under Arab leadership. Part of Jewish history is the ongoing humiliation and substandard status they experienced in medieval times. According to S.D. Gotain in the book Jews and Arabs, their contacts through the ages. There can be no doubt that the legal status of the Jewish religion under Islam, particularly during its early period when the Arabs were still predominant, was very much better than their situation in the Byzantine Empire. However, this does not mean that Jews had equal rights or were allowed to work and live any way they choose. Jews under Muslim rule in the Holy Land is discussed in the book Arabs and Jews, which states the following: in principle, they, Jews, and the other non-Muslims were second-class citizens, and consequently their position was always precarious, often dangerous. Although the Catholic expulsion of Spain in 1492 brought about the colonies in Tzfat, this does not mean that the Muslims were all welcoming to the exiles. Pilgrimage and settlement were to continue through the 14th century, mainly from Spain and Italy, with a smaller trickle from Germany. A new nucleus of Jewish population came into being, the Musta'arabi, those who spoke Arabic, the language of the country, as distinct from the European newcomers. Nonetheless, the great revival of the Jewish communities was to be linked with the migrations of Spanish Jewry that began at the end of the 14th century and were intensified over the next 150 years, that is, to the threshold of modern times and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. During that time, the Arab population and leadership disregarded Palestine, while Jews longed to return Eretz Israel to its former glory. Migration to historic Palestine. According to Jewish scholar Dr. Jonathan Roth, a Jewish presence in the Holy Land was consistent since medieval times. He wrote in correspondence with the author of this document the following: Jewish migration to Palestine was small from the 15th to the mid-19th century, but resulted in the cities have substantial Jewish minorities, about a quarter of the population in Jerusalem and Hebron, for example. It picked up in the latter 19th century, still relatively small, but it resulted in Jerusalem become a majority Jewish city by 1875. All of this was before Zionism existed as a formal movement. The aliyahs under Ottoman rule were very small. Even though Jews were fleeing from persecution in Europe, the vast majority went to the US. The big jump was between World War I and World War II. Yes, many were fleeing persecution, especially Nazi, but many immigrants were economic refugees. With this in mind, we must not forget of the risks, challenges, and opposition they faced to bring about a Jewish presence back to what they perceived as their homeland. Aftermath: the State of Israel's establishment. In modern history, there have been many anti-Semitic sentiments against the State of Israel from different nations, especially as anti-Semitic propaganda became commonplace in the Middle East after the State of Israel's inception. One of the State of Israel's most bitter opponents was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt, who in December 1953 declared the following outrageous claim: "To the disaster al-Nakba of Palestine, there is no parallel in human history." His exaggeration of the situation is part of the Arab narrative which has fueled years of mistrust and hatred toward the Zionist state. This led to the out-of-the-ordinary 1975 United Nations resolution in which Zionism was labeled a form of racism. Anti-Zionism, the common response to the Jewish independent state, makes it possible for anti-Semites to hide behind political opposition against Israel. In recent history, Israeli policies have become an excuse to discriminate against all Jews. These sentiments are anti-Semitic instead of political in nature, since they are directed to all Jews with no regard to the political views of individuals. The attacks on the Middle Eastern Jews after the establishment of the State of Israel was significant, although they only constituted 10% of the total Jewish population of world at that time. Books such as Unjust Zionism and Israel Among the Family of Nations discuss the ramifications of Jewish democratic political movements within the nation-state. What becomes apparent is that nationalism is what held the Jewish state together during its difficult short history. The international community appears to have reservations against both socialist and capitalist Israeli approaches to democracy. The critics of Israel concerned for Palestinian civilian casualties and human rights often forget the traumatic situation faced by Israelis. It is difficult to understate the impact on Israeli society of the threat posed to it in May 1967, the aftermath of the Six-Day War in early June, which placed Israel in occupation of substantial Arab population, the regeneration of Palestinian Arab nationalism, continuous terrorist attacks by Palestinian organizations against Israeli civilians, and the trauma of Israeli defeats and casualties in the initial stages of the 1973 war. All these exacerbated Jewish fears and sense of isolation. They encouraged and then reinforced the re-emergence of militant Jewish nationalism, both of a religious and secular varieties. Another important factor not often considered is that SI was a socialist experiment which revolutionized the Middle East. It was unheard of for any country to be led by the left in that region in the 1950s. The critics of SI are often extreme liberals who do not only want a classless society, but would like a utopian world where the ethnic identities of each community are erased. This is something that is impossible to achieve, especially as both Jews and Muslims hold their cultures and traditions very dear to their hearts. Current Israeli politics have made it clear that the socialist nature of the Zionist state is collapsing because of internal strife among the different political parties. The same democratic values allow Israeli liberal scholars to criticize Zionism. An example of this self-hating attitude is exhibited by Avi Shlaim and Ilan Pappé, who conveniently ignore Arab anti-Semitism and blame Israel for the situation. They never discuss the extreme nature of Arab persecution of Israelis, which was manifested during the 1967 war. Not a single Jew was allowed to remain in the part of mandatory Palestine which came under the control of the Arab armies during the war. The Jordanian army expelled even the population of the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, most of them ultra-Orthodox Jews and non-Zionists who refused to take part in the fighting. Rise to prominence. The nascent Zionist leadership, which included mostly socialists, were ignored and dismissed by the US and Britain. They aligned themselves with the USSR in the late 1940s as they needed help financing their project. Communists like Czechoslovakia were sympathetic to their cause, selling them weapons which allowed for them to win the War of Independence. Receiving minimal support from Western powers, it was the Jews from Arab countries and Iran between 1948 and the 1970s that helped the State of Israel survive. They are now half of the population, bringing about a Middle Eastern politique of status quo, which is often ignored by the opposition to the State of Israel. Democratic nature of the Jewish state. We now turn to David Ben-Gurion's vision for the State of Israel. Like no other, he wanted to have peace with his Arab neighbors. His writings show that Zionism was not interested in conquest, but in providing an opportunity for Jews to settle the Holy Land. He believed that this was possible without bloodshed. In his book, Meetings with Arab Leaders, Ben-Gurion wrote, quote, "The rights of the Arabs must not in any way and in any circumstances be infringed. It is just as unthinkable as well as impracticable to dispossess them of their land. This is not Zionism goal. Its true goal and its real possibilities are not to conquer that which is already inhabited, but simply to establish ourselves where the country's present-day inhabitants have not yet settled." End quote. Nowhere in his writings do we see a fascist or supremacist perspective in which religious persecution of Muslims or racial hatred of Arabs is advocated. He even believed that the Arab population had the right to self-determination and autonomy. However, Ben-Gurion's utopian dream of a Jewish state included all of Palestine with a majority Jewish population. Since then, this alternative has been crushed by a bitter sectarian war. We must consider how a multicultural or multi-ethnic nation, as proposed by Zeke Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionists, would have panned out. Zionism's desire for Jewish self-determination was achieved through the Jewish state. It came at a cost, since a homeland and refugee for world Jewry is also a target for the enemies of Israel. The Declaration of Israeli Independence proclaims the democratic nature of, quote, "the Jewish state, which would solve the problem of Jewish homelessness by opening the gates to all Jews and lifting the Jewish people to equality in the family of nations." End quote. What the critics don't seem to understand is that equality in relation to other countries demands for Jewish national independence. Sai not only celebrates Jewish identity, but provides identical rights to Jews from all over the world, something that is not guaranteed in the world stage. Jewish predominance is usually seen as supremacist. However, the reason Jewish culture is at the forefront of this democracy is because Judaism is not only a religion, but a way of life. Particularly as the Middle East is full of both ethnic, Arab, and religious Muslim states, of which no one denies their legitimacy. Quote, "The Jewish state necessarily has a Jewish character, which is expressed in features such as the official status of the Hebrew language. Although Arabic is also recognized as a second official language, the state emblems and symbols, the official weekly day of rest and holidays, as well as the character of its public education and its cultural life." End quote. This, according to Jacobson and Rubenstein book, Israel Among the Family of Nations. Relationship between religion and state. The modern state of Israel is frequently judged by either Christian standards or liberal values. The critics of religious Zionism often confuse the secular Jewish state, which honors Jewish tradition and does not discriminate against Jewish religious values, with an authoritarian theocracy which promotes one particular perspective. Both Israeli scholars, Sanz and Atmon, claim that the combination of military power and nationalized religion is the problem. However, they forget about the high percentage of secular Jews in the State of Israel. It often sounds as though they are discussing Saudi Arabia or Iran rather than Israel in their writings. Some Israeli scholars are concerned that certain religious leaders are pushing for ethnocentrism and discriminatory policies without realizing that this occurrence is part of having a democracy which allows multiple opinions to be heard. In the book Israeli Judaism, Studies of Israeli Society, the authors discuss, quote, "There is also little doubt that the particularization of Judaism in the hands of the religious elite and the acquiescence of the religious public in this narrowing Jewish vision finds support in the failure of alternatives, the bankruptcy of secular Zionism as a system of ideas and behavior being the most important." End quote. These factors are often exaggerated by the international community, which perpetuate biases and misunderstandings about the State of Israel. They also tend to vilify Judaism and assume that the Jewish homeland is an embodiment of these misconceptions. In my opinion, part of the problem is that most Westerners do not understand the relationship between religion and state in the Middle East and assume that Israel is a religious nation. My research concludes that there are no religious or racial groups being persecuted at this time as compared to the bloody history of Jews in the Middle East. Opponents of the Zionist enterprise want religious parties to be removed from politics in both the Middle East and America. Although very few individuals understand the complicated nature of this state or are willing to consider the geopolitical processes that brought about the current situation. Anti-Israel professor Mark Ellis writes the following: "The current Jewish establishment seeks a religion-state alliance parallel to that which early Christianity forged with the imperial state, an alliance also sought by the current Christian religious right in the United States." His lack of understanding of Judaism and Jewish history is obvious, as the vision of the founders of the State of Israel is more humanistic and pluralistic than what it is credited to be. Criticism against the Jewish state. Alan Dershowitz asked the following question in his book, The Case for Israel. Why do many Jews, including Israelis, support the Palestinians? The answer to that question is that the agenda of individuals such as Mark Ellis, Shlomo Sanz, Norman Finkelstein, and Gilad Atzmon is a convoluted one. Their anti-Israel books, such as Israel Does Not Equal Judaism, The Invention of the Land of Israel, or The Rise and Fall of Palestine, and The Wandering Who, a study of Jewish identity politics, often seem to address legitimate concerns until they become intellectually dishonest, outrageous, or self-hating. The sentiments expressed in such books are often shared by many non-Jews and undermine the Jewish background of the writers, showing their limited knowledge of the subject of Jewish identity and survival. While researching this matter, I often asked myself the following question: where do these misconceptions about the origin of Jewish longing for the Holy Land come from? One troubling fact is that some leftist Israeli and American Jews have believed the dominant conspiracies against Jews throughout the world. In other cases, ideology is what drives the attacks against the State of Israel, such as Finkelstein's strict pacifism or Atzmon's Nietzschean anti-government idealism, causing their discontent and leading them to ignore the worldwide plight of the Jewish people in the process. There are many allegations charged against the State of Israel by liberal thinkers, which often come from perspectives which are abstract, radical, and rather utopian, as they require the State of Israel to be a perfect model of liberal democracy. No nation has achieved this lofty goal so far. However, these critics still believe Jewish nationalism is problematic and think Zionism is one of the worst manifestations of an ethno-cultural nation-state. These individuals also consider this type of nationalism anti-individualist and anti-liberal. It appears that the only alternatives proposed by them, instead of Jewish civic nationalism, include assimilation or the creation of a multicultural nation-state like the ones in Europe. They do not take into account that the forced integration of Jews to a modern society in America and other countries is slowly destroying Jewish identity. By undermining Jewish survival and projecting a self-destructive alternative for Jews, they are unable to foresee that this perspective in time would bring about the collapse any vestige of cultural identifiers, to request for Jews to be without national pride or religious freedom. They are demanding something they would never request from any culture. The detractors of Zionism often presuppose that the State of Israel is at fault for everything wrong with the Middle East. They also accept as true the Palestinian extreme victimhood narrative. One example of this outlook is Israeli journalist and writer Uri Avnery, who describes what he believes are Israel's discriminatory practices that have been in place since its very foundation. Zionism entirely ignored the population of Palestine. It envisaged a homogeneous nation-state according to the late 19th century European model, with as few non-Jews as possible. This ideology is often what Palestinian writers and supporters advocate, but as we have discussed earlier, these are slanderous allegations. One Muslim writer, Reza Aslan, in his dissertation on Muslim nationalist groups, shows that there is a difference between Islamists, Muslim nationalist groups, jihadists who want global domination, and moderate Muslims who are the majority. The rise of Hamas in the Gaza Strip shows that the Palestinian population either supports or would prefer an Islamist state rather than a democracy in Palestine. Their militant stance does not seek a legitimate political solution to their situation, but proposes a predominantly Muslim regime. If allowed to thrive, Hamas would not provide equality to the many Jews living within the borders of the Holy Land. The West Bank situation is described by Zachary Foster as a non-violent alternative to the Gaza militant stance. He worries that the current administration of the State of Israel is oppressing the civil rights of Palestinians in this territory and, instead of supporting the rule of law, is propping puppet leaders as part of the sanctioned Palestinian Authority. Progressive fallacies. The supporters of the Palestinians have a liberal obsession with portraying Israel as a fascist regime, an offensive term which is part of anti-Zionist rhetoric. Often when their claims do not hold to scrutiny, anti-Israel authors decide to attack Judaism instead of the nation-state. One virulent claim is that the Zionists were not only colonizers, but religious manipulators who used Christian enthusiasm about the Holy Land for their purposes. These attacks are usually aimed at the heart of Judaism, which sees Jerusalem as the abode of God's sovereignty, not only the capital of the Jewish independent state. There is a uniqueness to the Jewish people that can't be denied, since most other people have not been scrutinized or persecuted in the same way by outside forces. Nevertheless, this reality bears no relevance to authors like Sands. He admits his bias in his book. My aim in writing it had been mainly to use historical and historiographical sources to question the ethnocentric and ahistorical concept of essentialism and the role it has played in past and present definition of Judaism and Jewish identity. Often the status of Jews after World War II as refugees in Palestine is ignored, and the partition, allocation of land to the State of Israel in 1947 is overshadowed by the 1967 annexation and the Palestinian refugee predicament. The Israeli assertion that they have to keep the Jordanian Valley for their safety is usually dismissed, and Israelis are depicted as bent on conquest. It is important to understand that many of the allegations made against the State of Israel come from what Dershowitz calls ideological and theological anti-Semitism, which surpasses the Zionism racism rhetoric. This outlook is often based on both Islamic and Christian ideologies, which undermine Judaism for their theological claims. Aslan questions the radicalization of Muslims to the point of them choosing to kill themselves and their children, which are actions condemned by Islam, while at the same time not denouncing the connection between Palestinian terrorists such as Abdullah Yusuf Azzam and global jihadists like the late Osama bin Laden. His naivete regarding Palestinian involvement with global terror networks is problematic, as well as his liberal bias, which believes it is permissible to attack a religion but not a group of people. Aslan uses the rhetoric often promulgated by people from his camp who believe they can ridicule Judaism and not be anti-Semitic at the same time. International objections. Certain sectors of the international community portray the Jewish nation as a racist regime which destroyed the territorial integrity of Palestine in 1948. Global Jewry are often caught in the middle of Israel battles, as the very complicated nature of the conflict is often simplified and trivialized. Setting the historical realities aside, critics of the State of Israel often repeat catchphrases without analyzing the information. One example of this is Professor Mark Ellis's attack on Zionism. The creation of the State of Israel forced an ethnic cleansing of more than 700,000 Palestinians to create room for the Jewish state. He conveniently forgets about the international support for the establishment of the State of Israel. He never discusses the 1967 war and how Arab nations attacked Israel in an unfair battle for Muslim hegemony of the Holy Land. According to Sands, the Palestinians were denied their human rights and were abused in every way possible. He tries to emphasize Zionism's colonization of Palestine as it created an ethnocentric and segregationist nation, although this accusation assumes that there were no Jewish cities in the Holy Land at the time and that the original European settlers had no right to their homeland. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book Israel, An Echo of Eternity, responds to this rhetoric in the following way: "There is no greater fallacy than to regard Israel as a colonial phenomenon. No state in the world expresses the concept of nationhood more intensely than Israel. It is the only state which bears the same name, speaks the same tongue, upholds the same faith, inhabits the same land as it did 3,000 years ago. There are many international objections against the State of Israel, including allegations about human rights violations, opposition against their military tactics, and concerns about the control of the disputed territories and their population. Opponents of Zionism also allege that the State of Israel is determined to grow through the illegal annexation of Palestinian land. Many of these claims are based on Muslim rhetoric, which is refusal to be dominated by what they consider to be unbelievers. The Islamic religious world often paints the State of Israel in less than favorable ways, which helps their political and theological goals. They often exploit the plight of Palestinian refugees to indict the State of Israel as cruel and racist. Both Palestinians and their supporters believe old conspiracy theories about the aim of Zionism being world dominance. They never speak out against the Palestinian leaders who refuse to concede on some of their demands and often ignore the violent nature of their attacks against Israeli civilians. Because of these difficulties, SI has been forced to take the following actions, which are seen as part of Israeli unwillingness to seek peace. Not only has it placed the Arab population under a military administration supposedly temporary, but in fact lasting for decades, but it has also created two populations living in the same area under two different legal systems. The critics of Zionism believe segregation has been the goal of the State of Israel inception. Even the pro-Israel book, Israel and Family of Nations, struggles to explain Jewish fascination with separation, which makes Israelis appear xenophobic. However, this strategy is based on security concerns, not religious particularism. One aspect of Israeli history often forgotten is that they originally fought against communist forces in the Middle East. The communists in both Europe and the Middle East were often anti-Semitic and considered Jews the enemy. The Arab militant groups, at one point, were part of the anti-imperialist camp led by the Soviet Union. This predicament has helped to shape the international perspective on Israel, which portrays Arabs as liberators and Jews as oppressors. Conclusion. In conclusion, we cannot dismiss the pain of both Israeli Jews and the Palestinian population have experienced or minimize their grievances. The injustices experienced by these communities should always be considered. However, as a student of the conflict, I have found that ethical as well as moral concerns about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are at times ignored or dismissed. It is difficult for each group to concede that their leaders are capable of committing criminal acts. In my research for this project, I have found many inconsistencies among conservative and progressive approaches to the issue as well. I believe that further research should be done on this subject and that the following questions should be explored. What should be the national solution for the Palestinian people, since they have two territories controlled by two different parties? And what alternatives are available for the people in the Palestinian territories who have not been able to create a sustainable government throughout the years? One of my contentions against the anti-Israel lobby is that they see the 1947 partition as a mistake. However, according to the book Israel in the Family of Nations, quote, "The UN saw the establishment of this state as an act of historic justice for the Jewish people and a humanitarian solution to the problem of the displaced Jews in Europe after the war, and also, in a broader sense, as a solution for the ancient problem of the Jews as a homeless people." Unquote. They also don't acknowledge that Arab opposition is what brought about the problem, since their extremist position created an irreconcilable conflict. Ben-Gurion believed that Jews, who have been a minority living in a hostile world, were constantly in danger and were not able to have a strong sense of self until they would achieve political freedom. Zionism provided an opportunity for persecuted Jews to create an independent Jewish nation. The original settlers were not only trying to restore the connection to historic lands, but were hoping to create a refuge for future generations. It is important for people to differentiate between the country of Israel and the ethno-religious civilization of Judaism, which are often confused by both Jews and Gentiles. However, we must look at Judaism's principles for guidance regarding this conflict. The concept of kavod habriot, human dignity, should be at the forefront of the modern Jewish state. The Jewish homeland should not only be concerned about security and survival, but embody Jewish values, ethics, and morals in everything they do. As I have demonstrated, SI is a symbol of hope for world Jewry and the only possible safe haven for those facing global anti-Semitism. However, Jews in both the State of Israel and abroad are accountable before God in everything they do. We must remember the following concept in the coming years. The holiness of the land of Israel is derived from the holiness of the people of Israel, something Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his 1987 book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity. This concludes the audio documentary, Is Zionism Evil, Unjust and Undemocratic? An uncensored special report, brought to you by Mystic Skeptic Radio, Dick Skeptic Radio, Dick Skeptic Radio, Dick Skeptic Radio.